So first principle is what we call training modality compatibility. Fact. Some facts to lay this out before we set out the principle. So there's only a certain amount of room in each muscle cell to put stuff, like the machinery that makes you contract, or mitochondria that gives you endurance. You can't have a cell that has the most contractile machinery possible and the most mitochondria possible, because they literally compete for physical space. It's like saying you want a car that has the biggest possible engine that you can fit into a car, and also you want the car to have the ability to seat 7 people. It's just one or the other, unless you want to make the car bigger, right? And if you want to make the car bigger, as you make the car bigger, now we can make the engine even bigger. So you never really can fill out everything because we have working with a certain unit. There's trade-offs. The nervous system has a limitation in its ability to be functionally flexible. More particularly, the nervous system can be really well trained to save its energy and save its sort of demands on the body, and ask the muscles to contract maybe not super maximally, and but with a lot of endurance. So the nervous system can get really good at sort of repetitive task stimulation, like running for 10 miles. The nervous system can really good at telling you to put your leg one in front of the other. On the other hand, the nervous system can also get good at really explosive activities, summoning all of your motor units, everything in your brain, to try to get you to have one gigantic explosion of effort, whether it's a jump or a push or a throw. If it gets really good at one of those things, it's literally using the same systems and structures and circuits that it would be to get really good at the other one of those things. You can't be the best at both because you're using the same thing. It's like having your computer be full of all sorts of word processing programs and programs for designing all kinds of presentations and, Adobe Photoshop and stuff, and also at the same time having your computer be optimized for gaming and online gaming. There's only so much room in your hard drive, and your processor can only eke out so much. You kind of got to pick which one you really want to prioritize. You could have a computer that does both okay, but not either one of those the best, right? Because if you have a gaming computer that's supposed to have everything free except for these, programs to make the gaming experience go well, you load up a bunch of other crap on there, especially if you have it running at the same time, and your gaming experience is going to slow down significantly, and vice versa. So same thing, the brain is a computer, and it only has a certain finite amount of resources to try to get your muscles to do as much of everything they can. There's some competition there in functionality. In addition, there's only so much contractile tissue you can have per body mass. So we'll come back to the cell example. You can stuff a whole lot of mitochondria into cells and not have a ton of contractile tissue, so the muscle cells are really good at endurance, but they don't exert a lot of force. They don't have the mechanics to literally produce much force, but they're super awesome at endurance at low levels of force. On the other hand, you can have very little mitochondria in a muscle cell and a whole lot of contractile machinery, great for force production and explosion, super crappy at endurance because mitochondria literally produce most of the energy that we need for endurance activity, and they're just not really around in sufficient amount to replenish that kind of volume of activity. So you can say, okay, well, why don't I just have a whole bunch of both kinds of muscle fiber types? Well, let's say you want to be the best combination thrower/endurance runner. You could have a whole lot of slow twitch fibers for the running side and a whole lot of fast twitch fibers for the throwing side. But because you're going to need a certain number of fast twitch fibers, a certain amount of muscle fiber that's faster twitch to be an elite thrower, and a certain amount of muscle fiber that's slow twitch to be an elite runner without being weighed down by other stuff, how the hell are you going to do that? You'd have to weigh like 400 pounds, or let's say 350, and have a whole bunch of slow twitch muscle reserved for the running, and a whole bunch of fast twitch muscle reserved for the throwing. But then when you're running, what the hell does the muscle for the throwing do? Fast twitch muscle doesn't help you at all when you're running. As a matter of fact, it can hurt you significantly just by accumulating lactate. If you run slow enough, maybe it doesn't activate as much. And then it just sits there. It's like a 150-pound backpack that you have to carry around everywhere you go. There's a reason marathon runners weigh like 150 or less pounds, is because they physically want to carry as little extra stuff as possible. So because we're limited to how much contractile tissue our body can carry and wants to carry because of extra weight, we can't fill it up with an infinity amount of stuff. We have to choose, right? So we can't be amazing at everything. And here's the thing. Some training modalities or specific abilities have much less of those systems that they use in common. Some have more systems that they use in common. The ones that have less systems that they use in common kind of compete more for resources and more demand. So for example, if you lived with a roommate and you both more or less ate like really similar stuff, could you just buy in bulk and shove all of your food into a pretty small pantry and fridge? Totally, because the big containers, they're nice and tall, and you can shove them in, you can buy in bulk and put stuff everywhere, no big deal. There's a lot of overlap between what you eat. But if you have a roommate that's a completely different diet than you're eating, can you fit all the stuff? Well, they're going to buy some stuff like just makes sense to buy in bulk that don't sell in small amounts, and so are you. You're going to have more overall stuff, just more different jars of stuff, and because jar space is, we have to have the actual can be made of something, all of a sudden we start to run out of room because we're trying to do too many different things at once. Just the same way, some things, for example, we'll get more into this in just a bit, endurance ability, use some systems, and some abilities like the ability to be very fast or powerful, they use a lot of the same systems, so they don't have a lot in common, and they compete kind of for resources to see which one is going to be best, thus interfering with each other, right? So if you want to be the best at some abilities, you have to trade out a lot of other abilities if they're not compatible with those. And if they are very compatible, then you don't have to trade off a lot of those abilities at all. This is especially true if you want to peak those abilities at the same time. Can you be a pretty good physique athlete and weightlifter? Yeah, but you do physique during the kind of peak for a show in July and peak for a weightlifting show in January, and you have kind of 6 months to really retool your training to become really good at one while the other sort of suffers. But if you're trying to peak at the same time, let's say you have a weightlifting meet in July and a week later you have a bodybuilding competition, geez, that's a lot of competitive demands and you're not going to be very good at either one of those things. So there are definitely some abilities that are more compatible than others, and fundamentally it's always a trade-off. So let's talk a little bit more about this. If you want to do concurrent training for 2 or more things at the same time to get as good as possible, what are some limiting factors? Well, first, training time. Why can't you get good at both things to their maximum ability? So you are either training for one thing or you're training for another thing, right? For the bodybuilding, weightlifting example, you're doing snatches and clean and jerks, or you're doing lateral raises and upright rows. You can't very well do both at the same time. So if you want to fit in everything it takes to be the best weightlifter and everything it takes to be the best bodybuilder, you have gone over the amount of time you have to train in a week. Okay, so we can't train infinity in a week. Let's say we can train 10 hours. We're going to have to remove some weightlifting training and remove some bodybuilding training, thus hurting both. Point number 2, what about recovery time, right? The more you are recovering from something, let's say soccer play, the less you can be recovering from something else, basketball. So let's say Tuesday, Thursdays you play soccer, Monday, Wednesday, Friday you play basketball. And you have other teammates in basketball that also play Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but they don't do soccer. So on Wednesday you come in and you're slow. You're tired. Your coach goes, what the hell's wrong with you? How come you're not moving? You're like, coach, I had soccer practice yesterday. So instead of using that time to recover from basketball, use that time to train soccer, and then use the rest of the time to recover from at least some combination of soccer and basketball. Well, that's no good. How are you going to be the best basketball player if you're busy recovering from soccer a lot of the time when you're trying to recover from basketball? You can't. There's no way to do it, right? Because we're dealing with finite resources. And lastly, not of least importance, are conflicting physiological conditions. So a good example, these are for why it's really difficult to be super powerful, explosive for 1 or 2 times, and really good at endurance at the same time. There are literal physiological processes that are different to optimizing one or the other, and they're usually relatively mutually exclusive. That means as your body gets really good at one, it gets worse at the other. They're opposing pathways. Here, example. So molecular regulators of cell activity. The ones that really get upregulated and make you better at power include ones like mTOR, right? So mammalian target of rapamycin. It's a protein that basically organizes hypertrophy and strength adaptations in the cell to some large extent. mTOR is not really turned on with endurance training. Another set of molecules and regulators is sort of generally called AMPK, adenosine monophosphate kinase. That system is turned on. AMPK directly impinges on mTOR. Literally, as AMPK turns on, it switches mTOR off or switches it down. It's like turning up one knob on kind of one of those switch lights that has a knob instead of a switch and turning another one down at the same time. You can't have both lights on at once because there's only so much energy coming in to the actual circuit. That's not really good. AMPK breaks down muscle and rewards endurance adaptations, while mTOR builds it. That's really not good at all. Brings us to our next point. What kind of muscle size physiology is sort of put forward by power training and rewarded in power? Well, big muscles produce more power, but on the other hand, small muscles, a low level of muscle size, is rewarded because it has a higher relative endurance in endurance sport. So if you're really gigantic, you're not going to be very good at endurance sport, but if you're really, really small, you're not going to be very powerful. Again, trade-offs that there's no way to be both, right? How can you be both big and small at the same time? You can be medium, but then you're not really great at either one of those things. Fatigue states, the kind of training that is required for endurance generates a ton of fatigue that you're carrying all the time. Good news is that fatigue doesn't really interfere with endurance training very much at all. I mean, crazy levels of fatigue to start interfering with endurance adaptations. On the other hand, power as a training variable is incredibly sensitive to fatigue. As soon as fatigue rises beyond some pretty low point on the scale of endurance for sure, we start to see declines in power training ability, declines in power output, and you just start getting worse, and there's no way to get better unless you drop that fatigue. So if you try to train for both power and endurance at the same time and really get the most out of them, one of the fatigue environments from endurance literally poisons the training for the power environment. And that's no good at all. We can't have the best of both worlds. What about fiber type? Well, fiber type probably changes slowly and to some very small extent with long-term training. And also there's genetics for fiber type that we all start out with that give us kind of the basic blueprint of the average of where we're going to be the rest of our lives. Slow twitch fiber types are really rewarded in endurance activity, while fast twitch fiber types are rewarded in power activity. So even through training or genetics, you can't have both, right? It's one or the other, particularly when you're talking about literally zooming in on cells. You can't be good at both. You can't have both. It's two different kinds of machines, right? And lastly, are neural characteristics. Endurance training favors and actually develops your nervous system into being able to perform submaximal repetitive contraction of the musculature, submaximal repetitive movements that don't fatigue you a lot. The purpose is fatigue resistance. But power training both trains and rewards explosive, highly fatiguing movements because we don't care about fatigue because we only have to do it a couple of times and then we win the event. So we're trying to get our nervous system to be amazing at two different things, which is pretty much impossible. We got a big, very serious problem here. So concurrent training, there are intelligent ways to combine certain things, but fundamentally we have to admit we're working at a trade-off. Can you have a combination best pickup truck, station wagon, race car? Yeah, you can. Is that going to be the best pickup truck? No way. It's got too much race car and station wagon stuff to interfere with the best pickup truck. For example, instead of having a ton of bed space, you have a big engine. And also, you have an elongated car because you need the station wagon part too, right? So can we have a good average approach? Totally. But do we have to admit that if we take it on the track, it's going to get embarrassed? Yes. Is it going to be a great pickup? No. Is it going to be a great station wagon? Also probably not. Because we're working with limited resources and one thing has to trade off away from another. So got this cool little chart up for you guys, and this is mostly for your own sort of personal knowledge, but remember we said that some modalities interfere much more highly with other modalities than they do with still other modalities. So we have a list for you here as a 1 to 11 list, as a 1 to 10 list, but the first one is a pretty cool example, not from training, of modalities that tend to interfere greatly with each other versus ones that don't tend to interfere very much. So the first one is muscle gain versus fat loss. Okay, it's nutritional, but it's still a great example. How much does attempting to gain muscle and do your very best at it interfere with fat loss? Well, let's see. Gaining muscle and doing your best means hypercaloric diet, more calories than you burn. How much does that interfere with fat loss? Almost completely in anyone other than beginners and very other interesting times of the training process. So there's a huge interference there. So what's the lesson there? The lesson is if you try to do both at the same time, you're probably going to get very close to nowhere. Probably a good idea to maybe do them in sequences or phases so they're not being done at the same time. Next one. Remember, the ones at the top, the ones I'm reading first, they're the most interfering down to the least. And this will make very good sense to you once I start kind of reading them off. Endurance interferes with speed training. So endurance training interferes with speed training a lot. Why? Because speed training is done at a low fatigue, super explosive state with fast twitch muscle fibers. Endurance is very opposite of every single measurable quality, except for the fact that you're still using your legs, right? Endurance training interferes with power just a little less than speed because power has a bigger force component and not as much of an explosive component as speed. It's not as fatigue sensitive, but everything else is pretty much the same, huge interference effect. Endurance training interferes with strength training quite a bit. So can people be both very strong and very endurant? Yes, because they don't need the nervous system qualities of incredible explosiveness anymore. And strength training is a bit more fatigue resistant. It doesn't get damaged so much or impinged so much with high fatigue levels as do power and strength. So you can have quite a bit of both, still pretty big interference. What about endurance and size? Well, muscle size, we really don't super care about fiber type. We care almost not at all about nervous system characteristics or explosiveness, and training for size is quite a big fatigue threshold, so there's not a huge level of interference there, but there's still a significant one. Next level of interference, so number 6. Does training to be as big as you can interfere with speed? Well, hell yeah, it does. But you're going to be pretty fast because you've got a lot of muscle and that moves a lot. So it's already nothing like endurance interfering with everything else. How much does size interfere with power? Well, if you just train for pure size, you're doing lots of sets of 10, sets of 12. That's not very good power training. But you do have a lot of big, really strong muscles. That is no longer super interfering. How much does size interfere with strength? Well, again, sets of 10, sets of 12 versus sets of 3 to 5, much more fatigue versus strength training. There's some interference there, but it's not huge. You can be really big and really strong at the same time. The rest of these are only minutely different from each other. So is it possible to train for maximum strength and maximum speed at the same time? Yeah, there's only a tiny bit of fatigue-based interference. Is it possible to train for strength and power at the same time and be very good? Absolutely. You just have to make sure that as the competition approaches, maybe the last couple of weeks, you pull most of your strength training to really let fatigue fall, to really let power rise. And what is the difference between power and speed? Again, tiny little fatigue difference, a little bit of a specificity difference. Power and speed almost don't interfere with each other at all. So if you want to say I want to be as powerful as possible and as fast as possible, well, gee, getting as powerful as possible is probably a really good way to becoming as fast as possible. So there's a huge overlap there. So if someone says, now hold on, you're trying to train for power and speed at the same time, training modality compatibility sub-principle says it's not a good idea. No, it actually says it's a great idea because the compatibility is incredibly high. But if you tell someone you want to be training for marathons and you want to be the fastest 60-meter sprinter that you can be, you got another thing coming. That's going to be a really big problem.